Lincoln's sacrifice, the heart of a nation torn. The room was dim, with only the flickering light of a single candle casting long shadows across the faces gathered. In the center sat Abraham Lincoln, his hands trembling as they gripped a letter. It was the winter of 1863, and the war was tearing the nation apart, one casualty at a time. Lincoln's gaunt face, etched with the lines of endless sleepless nights, revealed the gravity of the news he had just received. The letter in his hands was from a mother who had lost not one, but 3 sons in the war. She wrote not to blame, not to accuse, but to express the deep, unyielding pain of a broken heart. Lincoln, who had buried his own son Willie just a year before, felt the weight of her words pierce through him like a dagger. He knew the grief of losing a child, but to lose 3, he could scarcely comprehend it. This letter was the spark that ignited a firestorm of emotions within him. The country was bleeding, and he was at its helm, steering it through the storm. The tears welled in his eyes as he thought of all the mothers, fathers, wives, and children mourning their lost loved ones. He had to do something to show that their sacrifices were not in vain. The room fell silent as Lincoln rose from his chair, the letter still clutched tightly in his hand. He turned to his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, and spoke with a voice that trembled with the weight of the Union's suffering. "These boys," he said, "they died for the idea that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. We cannot let their deaths be in vain." Lincoln made an immediate decision to visit the battlefront. He needed to see for himself the faces of the men who were fighting and dying for this cause. Despite the protests of his advisors, who feared for his safety, he insisted. "I must go," he said firmly. "If I am to ask these men to give their lives, the least I can do is look them in the eye and thank them." As Lincoln arrived at the battlefield of Gettysburg, the sight that greeted him was one of unimaginable devastation. The air was thick with the stench of gunpowder and death. Rows of makeshift graves stretched out before him, each marked with a crude wooden cross. The ground was soaked with blood, and the cries of the wounded echoed in the air. Lincoln walked among the soldiers, his tall, lanky frame towering over them like a solemn guardian. His eyes, usually soft and kind, were now pools of sorrow as they met the gaze of each young man. He approached a soldier lying on the ground, his body mangled beyond recognition. The boy looked up at Lincoln, his eyes wide with fear and pain. "Mr. President," he gasped, struggling to breathe, "did we do enough? Did we make a difference?" Lincoln knelt beside him, taking the boy's hand in his own. He struggled to find the words, to offer some comfort in the face of such horror. "You did more than enough, son," he said, his voice breaking. "You fought for the freedom and unity of this nation. You are a hero, and your sacrifice will never be forgotten." The boy smiled weakly, his eyes fluttering shut as he took his last breath. Lincoln bowed his head, his tears mingling with the blood-soaked earth. This was the price of war, the cost of freedom. He knew now more than ever that he had to end this conflict, no matter the cost. Returning to the White House, Lincoln was a changed man. He was no longer just the president. He was a father, mourning the loss of thousands of sons. He poured his grief into his work, determined to bring an end to the war. It was during this time that he began to draft the Emancipation Proclamation, a document that would change the course of history. As he penned the words that would free millions of enslaved people, he thought of the mother who had written to him, of the countless lives that had been lost in this brutal conflict. He knew that this was the right thing to do, the only thing that could justify the rivers of blood that had been spilled. This was not just a war for the Union, it was a fight for the very soul of the nation. The proclamation was signed on January 1st, 1863, but Lincoln knew the road ahead was still fraught with peril. The war raged on, and with each passing day, more letters arrived on his desk, each one telling the tale of another fallen soldier, another shattered family. Lincoln carried these stories with him, each one a reminder of the cost of freedom. In April of 1865, as the war drew to a close, Lincoln visited the front lines once more. The end was in sight, but the toll it had taken on him was evident. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, but there was a glimmer of hope in them, a hope that this nation could finally be healed. He stood before the soldiers, the men who had given everything for this cause, and spoke with a voice that resonated with the weight of history. 77 years ago, he began, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. His words echoed across the battlefield, a testament to the courage and sacrifice of those who had fought and died. He spoke of a new birth of freedom, of a government of the people, by the people, for the people, that shall not perish from the earth. The soldiers listened, their hearts swelling with pride and sorrow, knowing that they were a part of something much larger than themselves. As Lincoln finished his speech, the air was thick with emotion. The soldiers stood in silence, some with tears streaming down their faces. They had seen the horrors of war, had felt the sting of loss, but in that moment they felt a glimmer of hope, a hope that the sacrifices they had made were not in vain. But fate is a cruel mistress, and just days later, on April 14th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. The nation was plunged into mourning as the news spread like wildfire. The man who had held the Union together, who had fought for the freedom of millions, was gone. As Lincoln lay on his deathbed, his thoughts were not of himself, but of the country he loved so dearly. His final words were a plea for unity, a hope that this nation, torn apart by war, could be made whole again. There is no room for revenge in this great Union, he whispered. Only room for healing. The country mourned the loss of its leader, the man who had steered them through the darkest days of their history. The soldiers wept, the mothers and fathers wept. The entire nation wept for the man who had given everything for the cause of freedom. In the years that followed, the nation would struggle to heal, to bridge the divides that the war had wrought. But they would always remember Abraham Lincoln, the president who had stood tall in the face of adversity, who had carried the weight of the Union on his shoulders, and who had paid the ultimate price for the freedom and unity of his people. Lincoln's legacy lived on in the hearts of the people, in the ideals he had fought so hard to preserve. He was more than just a president. He was a symbol of hope, of resilience, and of the unbreakable spirit of a nation. His story was not just the story of a man. It was the story of a country that had been torn apart, but was slowly, painfully, being pieced back together, one sacrifice at a time. And so, the story of Abraham Lincoln is not just a story of war and death. It is a story of hope, of the enduring belief that even in the darkest of times, there is a light that can guide us through. It is a story of a man who gave everything for the idea that all men are created equal, and that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom,